Private Wilbur Fisk of the 2nd Vermont Infantry described the surreal nature of the combat. In a letter home, "We were fighting ghosts in a burning forest. A man might fire at movement in the brush only to discover he had shot at his own shadow. The smoke was so thick we could not tell friend from foe, until we were close enough to touch bayonets." Confederate morale, initially high due to their familiarity with fighting in difficult terrain, began to crack as casualties mounted and ammunition ran short. Hill's corps had been reduced to scavenging cartridges from the dead and wounded. Some regiments resorted to loading their rifles with nails, buttons, and pieces of metal when traditional ammunition was exhausted. The arrival of Longstreet's 1st Corps remained Lee's best hope for turning the tide, but distant and difficult roads meant his veterans would not reach the battlefield until the following morning. Lee found himself committed to a night battle with inadequate forces, a situation that would test his legendary composure and tactical brilliance. Union Artillery Chief Brigadier General Henry J. Hunt attempted to bring his guns forward to support the infantry assault, but discovered that the wilderness had rendered his powerful batteries almost useless. The few roads suitable for artillery movement were clogged with wounded men, supply wagons, and confused infantry units trying to reestablish contact with their parent formations. As darkness began to fall, both armies faced a strategic dilemma. Grant's numerical superiority had been neutralized by terrain, but his forces held the vital road intersection. Lee's tactical expertise had kept his smaller army competitive, but his men were exhausted and desperately short of supplies. The night would bring new challenges, as both commanders prepared for what promised to be an even more vicious day of fighting. Neither army could disengage safely. The wilderness had trapped them in an embrace of mutual destruction from which only complete victory or total exhaustion would provide escape. The pre-dawn hours of May 6, 1864, brought little respite to the exhausted armies locked in the wilderness's deadly embrace. Throughout the night, scattered rifle fire had punctuated the darkness as nervous sentries fired at shadows and sounds. The wounded, scattered throughout the undergrowth, created a chorus of suffering that haunted both Union and Confederate lines. Grant, demonstrating the aggressive instincts that had brought him success in the Western theater, ordered a general assault at dawn. Hancock's 2nd Corps, reinforced during the night, would spearhead the attack along the Orange Plank Road while Warren and Sedgwick maintained pressure on Ewell's positions to the north. The Union commander was determined to crush Lee's army before it could receive reinforcements or organize an effective defense. Hill's Confederate 3rd Corps, decimated by the previous day's fighting and critically short of ammunition, faced annihilation as Hancock's masses prepared to sweep westward. The situation appeared hopeless when suddenly the distinctive rebel yell echoed through the forest from the south. Longstreet's 1st Corps, after an exhausting all-night march, was arriving on the field at the precise moment needed to save Lee's army. The timing proved miraculous, as Hancock's assault crashed forward, overwhelming Hill's thin line and sending Confederate survivors streaming rearward in disorder. Longstreet's veterans deployed across the Orange Plank Road with mechanical precision. These were Lee's most experienced troops, hardened by campaigns from Manassas to Gettysburg, and they met the Union advance with devastating volleys that stopped Hancock's momentum cold. Brigadier General Joseph B. Kershaw's division struck the Union right flank with such force that entire regiments dissolved into panic. The dense forest that had hindered Confederate movements the previous day now worked to Longstreet's advantage, concealing his deployments while channeling Union attacks into prepared killing zones. According to James Robertson's Stonewall Jackson, the man, the soldier, the legend, this type of tactical surprise exemplified the Confederate Army's ability to transform defensive crisis into offensive opportunity. Through superior battlefield leadership and troop discipline, the parallel to Jackson's famous flanking attack at Chancellorsville was not lost on veterans of both armies. The fighting reached new levels of intensity as fresh Confederate troops clashed with battle-hardened Union veterans. The narrow front compressed the violence into a concentrated fury that defied description. Men fought with bayonets when their ammunition was exhausted, clubbed each other with musket butts when bayonets broke, and finally grappled with bare, Hands when weapons were lost in the smoke and confusion. Fire continued to be a constant threat, but now it served as a tactical weapon as well as natural hazard. Both sides began using burning brands to flush enemies from defensive positions, creating local infernos that forced entire units to abandon carefully prepared breastworks. The smoke grew so thick that noon resembled twilight, and commanders lost all ability to coordinate large-scale movements. Longstreet, sensing opportunity in the chaos, began organizing a flanking movement similar to Jackson's legendary attack the previous year, using an unfinished railroad bed that provided concealed movement through the forest. He positioned troops to strike the Union left flank where it anchored on the Brock Road. The attack promised to roll up Hancock's entire line and potentially destroy the Union's Second Corps, but fate intervened with cruel irony. As Longstreet rode forward to personally direct the flanking assault, his own men, confused by the smoke and poor visibility, fired into what they believed was a Union patrol. The volley struck down Longstreet and several staff officers, temporarily paralyzing Confederate command at the moment of maximum opportunity. The wounding of Longstreet removed Lee's most trusted corps commander at the critical juncture when Confederate fortunes appeared ready to turn decisively. The flanking attack proceeded, but lacked the coordinated leadership that might have achieved complete success. Instead of decisive victory, the Confederates gained only local tactical advantages that failed to translate into strategic breakthrough. As the afternoon of May 6th progressed, both armies remained locked in combat that had transcended military science and become a test of pure human endurance. By the afternoon of May 6th, the Battle of the Wilderness had evolved beyond the scope of traditional military engagement into something more primitive and terrifying. The forest itself had become a participant in the carnage, as dozens of separate fires merged into a conflagration that threatened to consume both armies. Regardless of their tactical positions, the wounded suffered most terribly from this new enemy. Hundreds of injured soldiers from both sides lay helpless in the undergrowth. As flames advanced through the dry vegetation, their screams created a soundtrack of horror that unnerved even the most battle-hardened veterans. Soldiers repeatedly broke from their positions to carry wounded comrades to safety, often exposing themselves to enemy fire in acts of desperate humanity. Private Warren Lee Goss of the 2nd Massachusetts Infantry described the hellish scene. The fire was more terrible than the enemy. We could fight the rebels, but against the flames we were helpless. Men would rather face a Confederate charge than watch the fire creep toward wounded friends they could not reach. Union and Confederate soldiers occasionally found themselves fighting side by side against their common enemy, the advancing flames. Informal truces developed in isolated pockets as men from opposing armies worked together to beat back fires or rescue trapped wounded. These moments of shared humanity provided brief respites from the madness that had engulfed the Wilderness. Grant, observing the battle from his headquarters, faced a commander's nightmare. His superior numbers meant nothing in terrain where regiments became lost and brigades fought as isolated companies. Artillery, the great equalizer in Civil War battles, remained largely useless due to the limited fields of fire and the constant danger of hitting friendly forces in the smoke and confusion. The psychological toll on both armies was immense. Veterans who had survived multiple campaigns found themselves reduced to a state approaching shell shock by the combination of invisible enemies, omnipresent fire, and the disorienting effects of dense smoke. Unit cohesion, the foundation of military effectiveness, crumbled as men became separated from their commands and fought as individuals, rather than organized formations. Lee, despite the loss of Longstreet's active leadership, continued to demonstrate the tactical brilliance that had made him legendary. He personally directed units into position, often exposing himself to enemy fire in a manner that alarmed his staff officers. The Confederate commander understood that his army's survival depended on maintaining defensive positions until nightfall would end the Union assault. Brigadier General Alexander Hayes, one of Hancock's most experienced division commanders, fell victim to the Wilderness's peculiar dangers when a Confederate sharpshooter, invisible in the undergrowth, struck him down at close range. His death exemplified how the forest had transformed warfare from grand tactical movements into individual duels between unseen opponents. The Union advantage in medical resources became meaningless when wounded soldiers could not be located in the maze of vegetation and smoke. Field hospitals established behind the lines found themselves treating men from units they had never heard of, soldiers who had become separated from their regiments and wandered for hours through the burning forest before finding medical care. Confederate ammunition shortages reached critical levels. As the day progressed, some regiments resorted to searching the bodies of dead Union soldiers for cartridges, while others withdrew from active combat positions simply because they had no bullets left to fire. Yet Lee's men continued to hold their lines through sheer determination and the knowledge that retreat might mean the destruction of their army. As evening approached, both commanders faced the grim reality that the Battle of the Wilderness had become a contest of attrition rather than tactical skill. The forest had reduced their armies to primal levels of combat, where survival instinct mattered more than military training, and where victory would go to whichever side could endure the most punishment while maintaining the will to continue. Fighting. The true test of grit and endurance was reaching its climax in the burning hell of the Virginia wilderness. As darkness mercifully descended on May 6th, the Battle of the Wilderness entered a phase that defied all conventional understanding of military operations. The night brought no respite from combat, only a transformation of its character from organized warfare to something resembling a supernatural nightmare. The fires that had tormented both armies throughout the day continued to burn and spread during the hours of darkness, creating an otherworldly landscape of orange light and dancing shadows. The crackling flames provided the only illumination for scattered groups of soldiers who found themselves cut off from their units and wandering through a forest that had become an alien terrain of danger and confusion. Both armies attempted to reorganize during the night, but the wilderness made normal military procedures impossible. Roll calls became exercises in futility as companies discovered they had lost half their men to the forest's maze. Regiments that had begun the battle with 800 men could muster fewer than 300, and many of the missing were not casualties, but simply lost souls wandering through the undergrowth in search of their commands. Grant used the cover of darkness to consolidate his forces and prepare for what he believed would be the decisive assault on May 7th. His determination to continue the offensive, despite the previous day's carnage, reflected the strategic thinking that would eventually win the war. Unlike his predecessors, Grant understood that the Union's advantage in resources meant he could afford casualties that Lee's smaller army could not sustain. The wounded created a logistics nightmare that overwhelmed both armies' medical services. Field hospitals, designed to treat casualties from conventional battles, found themselves inadequate for the unique wounds inflicted by fighting in the wilderness. Burns from forest fires, cuts from thorns and broken branches, and an unusually high percentage of head wounds from unseen snipers created new categories of military medicine. Confederate medical officer Dr. Hunter McGuire worked through the night, treating an endless stream of casualties, many of whom arrived at aid stations long after their wounds should have received attention. The forest had scattered our wounded across miles of impenetrable terrain, he later wrote. Men crawled for hours seeking help, leaving trails of blood through the underbrush that guided rescue parties to others who had collapsed from exhaustion. Resupply operations, routine in conventional battles, became epic undertakings in the wilderness. Ammunition wagons could not navigate the narrow trails, forcing soldiers to carry supplies forward on their backs through terrain where a wrong turn could mean wandering lost for hours. Water became precious as streams were choked with debris from the fires and often contaminated by the dead. Lee spent the night reorganizing his command structure to compensate for Longstreet's absence. He elevated subordinate officers to temporary leadership positions and redistributed units to create a defensive line that could withstand another day of Union attacks. The Confederate commander's calm demeanor provided a stabilizing influence on troops who had been pushed to the limits of human endurance. The psychological impact of the night fighting proved as significant as its physical effects. Soldiers on both sides reported encounters with enemy patrols that vanished like ghosts into the forest, leading to theories that the wilderness was haunted by the spirits of men killed at Chancellorsville. The boundary between reality and hallucination blurred for men who had been without sleep for 48 hours while fighting in conditions that challenged their sanity. Union Corporal Rice C. Bull of the 123rd New York Infantry described the eerie atmosphere. The night was filled with sounds that belonged to no earthly battle. We heard voices calling for help from directions where no living men should be, saw lights moving through the forest that disappeared when approached, and felt the presence of watchers who remained forever invisible in the shadows. Both armies attempted to use the darkness for tactical advantage, sending out reconnaissance patrols and raiders to disrupt enemy operations. These missions often resulted in firefights between friendly forces, who mistook each other for enemies in the confusing terrain and poor visibility. As dawn approached on May 7th, neither army had achieved decisive advantage, but both had been fundamentally changed by their experience in the wilderness. The battle had become a crucible that tested not just military skill, but human character itself. Dawn on May 7th, 1864, revealed the true cost of the Battle of the Wilderness. What emerged from the smoking forest was not the decisive victory either side had sought, but rather a profound transformation in the character of both armies and their understanding of warfare itself. The casualty reports, when finally compiled, told a story of unprecedented suffering. Grant's Army of the Potomac had suffered over 17,000 casualties, while Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had lost approximately 11,000 men. But these numbers failed to capture the battle's true impact on the soldiers who survived the ordeal. The wilderness had stripped away the romantic notions of warfare that had sustained both armies. Through 3 years of conflict, veterans who had charged across open fields at Gettysburg and Antietam found themselves fundamentally changed by 2 days of fighting an enemy they could rarely see in a forest that had become their common foe. The battle had reduced warfare to its most basic elements: individual courage, unit loyalty, and the simple determination to survive. Grant's decision to continue the campaign rather than retreat marked a crucial turning point in the war's trajectory. Previous Union commanders had withdrawn after similar casualties, but Grant understood that the North's superior resources made this battle part of a larger strategy of attrition. His famous message to Washington, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer," reflected a new approach to warfare that Lee's army would find impossible to counter indefinitely. The Confederate Army, despite its tactical success in neutralizing Union numerical superiority, faced a strategic crisis. Lee had prevented Grant from achieving a quick victory, but at the cost of irreplaceable veterans whose loss would weaken the Army's future effectiveness. The wound to Longstreet deprived Lee of his most trusted corps commander at a time when experienced leadership was becoming increasingly scarce. Perhaps the most significant impact of the Wilderness Battle was its effect on the character of individual soldiers. Men from both armies discovered reserves of endurance they had not known they possessed. They learned to function effectively despite exhaustion, fear, and the constant presence of death. The forest had become a forge that tempered human character in ways that would influence their lives long after the war ended. Sergeant Major William H. Andrews of the 1st Georgia Regulars captured this transformation in his memoir. "We entered the wilderness as soldiers, but emerged as something harder and more enduring. The forest had burned away everything non-essential, leaving only what was strongest in each of us. We had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the determination to continue fighting, despite being afraid." The battle's aftermath revealed the Union Army's growing maturity as a fighting force. Despite the horrific casualties, morale remained intact because the soldiers understood they were participating in a campaign that would finally end the war. Previous defeats had demoralized Union troops because they seemed meaningless, but the Wilderness was different. It was part of a coherent strategy that offered hope for ultimate victory. Confederate soldiers, while maintaining their legendary fighting spirit, began to recognize the mathematical reality of their situation. They could win tactical victories, like the Wilderness, but each success came at a cost they could not afford indefinitely. The South's manpower reserves were approaching exhaustion. while the North seemed capable of replacing its losses indefinitely. The Battle of the Wilderness had become the ultimate test of grit and endurance, transforming everyone who survived it and setting the stage for the war's final, inevitable conclusion. In the burning forest of Virginia, both armies had discovered the outer limits of human determination and learned that sometimes survival itself constitutes victory.